Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Wednesday evening Bible study with the Nicholasville Church of Christ. I hope everyone has had a good week so far. You may notice I'm recording in the church auditorium, which is not where I normally record Wednesday night Bible class. I've been recording in the church office the past couple of weeks, but decided I didn't really like the lighting in there, so I thought we'd return to the auditorium for Bible class this evening. But last week, just as a way of review in our series Theological Themes in the Old Testament, last week we talked about the curse of sin and the curses that come over all humanity and all creation because of sin. And that wrapped up 3 straight weeks of thinking about the creation accounts, the Garden of Eden, what we can learn from the first chapters of the Bible. And I realize it probably seems like we're moving at a pretty slow pace through the Old Testament. We're still close to the very beginning. But trust me, it's good that we took our time there. And things will really begin to pick up the pace now that we've gone from creation to curse and the curse of sin. So we left off last week with creation in a very dark place. Sin had entered the world through Adam and Eve and through their sinful choices. And sin drastically changes their life. It changes the life of all people who will come after them, and it drastically changes creation as a whole. And unfortunately, things simply continue to spiral downward from there until we reach our pivotal figure and our next pivotal covenant in the story of redemption, and that's Noah and God's covenant with Noah. And this is the famous story with Noah of the flood. And like with Adam and Eve, a person doesn't really have to be raised in church to be familiar with this story. It's one that is just so well known. But if you were raised in a church context, it's probably one of the earliest Bible stories that you were ever told. And it's fascinating to think of a little man with his family on a boat full of animals being protected by God. And so, from that angle, Noah and the flood, it's really good children's story material. But from another angle, this is quite a horrifying story. And if we think about it a little bit more, the reality of what is happening during the flood, it's not exactly children's story material. So I'd like us to begin by looking in Genesis 6 and reading verses 5 and 6. And here we read, The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So humanity has become so consumed in sin that it has eclipsed everything God intended for them as bearers of his image. They were created in his image. But now evil reigns in God's creation. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 16, we read of more sin from the very start with Cain murdering Abel, so right after Adam and Eve. But then apparently after that, the infection of sin gradually builds up to the time of Noah. Also in chapters 4 and 5, we get genealogical lists separating the events of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel from Noah. And the numbers alone in this list suggest that centuries, millennia have passed. Now, I mentioned in a previous class that we need to be careful not to read ancient genealogies like modern ones. And modern genealogies tend to insist on precision and thoroughness to a degree that ancient ones did not. So we might be looking at considerably even more time than the genealogy suggests when we take that into consideration. So given such a large span of time, I doubt that all throughout that time everyone is just living in huts. Entire civilizations are likely developing, and there are some hints of that we get along the way through those genealogies. But over time, throughout that time, evil and sin, the evil that originated in the garden, it fills the earth and it consumes humanity. Now, I mentioned last week that our rescue story, the story of redemption, it begins here. But things definitely get much worse before they get better. So sin has consumed humanity at this point, so things have gotten much worse. So going back to Genesis 6, let's read together verses 7 and 8. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So God's judgment is to blot out humanity because of their sin, but we read of one exception to the rampant wickedness on the earth, and that's Noah. And this one exception is going to be spared God's judgment, and God will enter into a new covenant with him. So he instructs Noah to build an ark according to very precise measurements, and animals are brought into the ark to be spared from the flood, and Noah enters the ark with his family. And God decides that the way he is going to go about wiping out wicked humanity is through water. It is through the flood. There's some interesting info that has survived from the ancient Near East, from that world, that relates to the flood. There are several ancient accounts of a great deluge or a great flood wiping out humanity, and each one describe the gods trying to wipe out humanity and someone building a boat to save a small group of people. So one could argue that when several ancient mythological accounts all describe the same event, that suggests that perhaps something actually happened that gave birth to those accounts. Now, I don't think that argument alone is definite proof, but it's still some valuable supporting evidence of the biblical flood. There's also the region. You can see a map of Mesopotamia that's on the screen here. And the region there between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that was also a region that was well known for catastrophic flooding. And there's evidence of two massive floods in that region, one in the 4th millennium BC and one in the 3rd millennium BC. Now, this observation right here leads into the question of whether this was a universal flood, a flood that covered the whole earth, or if perhaps it was a local flood, a flood just covering a region of the ancient Near East. That Tigris and Euphrates flooding observation, that really only fits with the local flood view, though I suppose one could argue that God used a natural local flood and then supernaturally turned it into a universal flood or something like that. But the traditional answer is that it was a universal flood. And discussing this, whether it was a universal or local flood, it can become quite controversial because many feel that the reliability of the Bible is at stake, depending on which option someone takes. And perhaps you've heard some Christian apologists, and apologist just means someone defending the Christian faith. Perhaps you've heard someone like that give scientific evidence to support the idea that at some point, perhaps a great flood covered the whole earth. Like with creation, I think there needs to be someone more scientifically trained than me to evaluate the validity of those arguments. The sciences are just simply not a great strength of mine. But I do think I can weigh in on the textual as well as the potential theological significance of both options. There are two things that I think are crucial to guide our understanding of the flood if we consider the flood to be an historical event. First of all, I think any explanation must align with the way Scripture itself describes the event. And secondly, the flood must be at least great enough to accomplish God's purpose. And his purpose was to destroy all living things except Noah and his family. So it has to be at least widespread enough to cover everywhere that both humans and beasts live. Now, if we were just talking about humans, perhaps a local flood would work better because the degree to which humans have spread across the earth could still be quite limited. But God's intention here is to wipe out both man and beast. Now, the account in Genesis does not only say that every living thing died, it is adamant about it. It drives home the reality that every human and beast has been blotted out. So this is Genesis 7, verses 21 through 23 on the screen, and I'll just read it to show how adamant the text is about this. It says, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind. Everything on the dry land, in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark." So again, the language is really strong about everything except Noah being caught up in this judgment. So these observations, I think, best support the universal flood option. Now, some suggest that the words in the verses that we just read, words like all and every, they might reflect Noah's point of view, meaning everything that he could see was covered with water and destroyed, instead of meaning everything on the planet. That option is possible, I think, but I also think it's less likely. Secondly, a universal flood, I think, fits better with the theological significance of the flood. God did not pick water at random as the way to destroy every living thing. He could have picked fire, or he could have picked disease, or he could have picked a meteor, or he could have just let humanity just devour one another as sin continues to run rampant on the earth. But he chose water. And water covering the whole earth, that might remind you of a key passage. I'm talking about Genesis 1 and verse 2. There we read that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the deep, with the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. And when we talked about that, we talked about how this world began as a place of disorder and chaos, and God brought harmony and order out of that disordered world. So here in the flood, God is plunging the world back into the disorder and chaos of Genesis 1 and verse 2 so that he can really and truly start fresh with Noah and his family. So there's parallelism with the way God creates and the way God recreates. Now, this imagery could still apply to a local flood, but it fits more neatly with the universal flood option, I think. So maybe those are some things to think about when considering that question, or perhaps if you're ever in a discussion where that question gets going. This leads nicely into some other theological observations about the significance of water in both this event and in the Bible as a whole. Again, the flood is God plunging the world back into the disorder of Genesis 1 to start fresh with Noah. Also, there is a considerable difference between modern and ancient conceptions of the sea. Ancients associated the sea with chaos and uncertainty, and it was a place that they greatly feared. Now, hopefully, we have a healthy fear of the sea, but our healthy fear is informed by science and it's informed by experience and these types of things. Not quite as much with the ancient mindset, definitely not with science, but it was informed by experience. But ancient Near Eastern people wondered, like we do, why the sea has boundaries and why it does not cover the whole land. Well, their answer to that was that the gods must hold the sea in check. And so when floods happen, that's the gods letting the waters loose upon humanity. And so God's use of flood waters to destroy the earth, that fits with this ancient conception of the sea. He has complete authority over the sea, and it only goes beyond its boundaries at his command. This is really helpful to keep in mind, not only for thinking about the flood, but also for other references to the sea throughout the Bible as well. God also displays his power over the sea by using it as a means of deliverance for his people. And this is a recurring theme throughout the Bible. Here, God will deliver Noah and his family from the wickedness of the earth through water. Baby Moses in the beginning of the book of Exodus will be saved by being placed in a basket in a river of water. The children of Israel will be delivered from Egypt through God commanding the waters of the Red Sea to part. The waters will again part as Israel crosses the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And then Jesus, he will display his command of the sea by both walking on the sea and commanding the stormy sea to be calm. We are united with Christ, and our sins are forgiven through burial in water in baptism. And the description of our eternal dwelling place at the end of Revelation, it specifically says there that there is no more sea. That might sound like an odd detail at first. If you've read recently the description of the New Jerusalem at the end of Revelation, it might seem odd that there's no more sea. But this fits with this ancient understanding of the sea as chaos and disorder. There is no chaos or disorder in eternity and in the presence of God. So the sea is far more than just part of the physical world of the Bible. It is both a place of disorder and chaos, a place to be feared, and it's also the means by which God shows his power and brings deliverance regularly all throughout Scripture. Now, in this list of things that we just walked through, baptism is the act of deliverance that's most relevant to us because we continue to practice it. The other events were one-time events. But I'd like us to read from 1 Peter chapter 3 and thinking about this connection. 1 Peter 3 verses 20 and 21. There we read, because, it's kind of mid-thought here, but it says, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, this connection between saving waters in the Old Testament and saving waters in the New Testament is not a connection that is made up. The New Testament explicitly makes this connection. I think this is important for us to dwell on for a moment. Baptism is more than just obeying an arbitrary command to be dunked in water. It is partaking in a means by which God displays his power and brings deliverance, and this is an ancient way of doing it. Romans 6 also connects our baptism specifically to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And so both of those observations, I think, should fill the act of baptism with rich meaning, and I hope help us better appreciate its significance. So again, the sea is a place of chaos. God displays his power by having control over it, and he regularly uses it as a means by which he delivers his people. So now that the grim but just task of purging the creation of its wickedness, now that that task is done, God enters into a covenant with Noah. And this is really a covenant with all of creation. And the entire passage about this covenant stretches from chapter 8 and verse 20 all the way through 9 and verse 17. I'll just read part of it. This is chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. Here we read, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning from every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it.'" So Noah twice receives the same command that Adam and Eve received at creation: be fruitful and multiply. Noah is essentially filling the role of a new Adam here. And this fits with the idea of God using the flood to recreate the earth and start fresh. And notice that there are a couple of new elements in God's instructions and blessings that were not present in the covenant of creation. Humans are now given animals to eat, just like they have been given the plants to eat at creation. We also have the stipulation that they cannot eat meat with its blood. And this leads into God saying that whoever sheds the blood of another man, his blood will be shed. And this is because humans are made in God's image. I think that what we're seeing are added stipulations to compensate for the reality that this recreation is still a fallen one. It is still a fallen world, even though it has been recreated. Wicked people have been destroyed in the flood, but sin itself, it's still an active force in the world. And thus creation, because it's still an active force in the world, creation cannot fully function as it first did in Genesis 1 and 2. And so God's instructions here reflect that reality. Also, let's look at chapter 9, verses 8 through 10. Here we read, "Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, 'Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth.'" So this is where we see the universal nature of God's covenant with Noah. This is actually God's covenant with all creation, not just with Noah. And then you can also see in verses 12 and 13, the sign to ratify this covenant is God setting his bow in the cloud. And with that, the first step of God's rescue operation for humanity is underway. And it is not a cheery one. This is a grim and dark chapter of the larger story of the Bible that we read. Sin consumes humanity. Sin runs its course and infects all of humanity. And God then rids the world of wickedness and he recreates it through the flood. And he enters into a new covenant with creation through Noah. But even in this grim part of the Old Testament, I think we learn some important things about God's power, his holiness, and also his means of deliverance. So next week, the Old Testament story advances to Abraham, where God begins to go to work in this recreated but still fallen world to ultimately redeem humanity. And it's going to begin with Abraham. So I'm looking forward to that. But thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you all are doing well. Have a great rest of the week. I hope to see many of you on Sunday. Thank you. Take care.